Welcome to the Bible in 1 Year podcast, brought to you by two Brits and a Bible of things.
If Adam and I survive this, we'll be doing day 132.
Welcome to the Bible in 1 Year podcast, brought to you by two Brits and a Bible. If you like the idea of a casual but meaningful chat about the Bible with a couple of mates, listen in. Something in here could be good for you.
Today is day 132, covering 2 Chronicles 6, 7 and 8. If you need a brief overview of those chapters, they're in the description.
You're up, boy.
I am up today. So, straight in. Then he said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hands has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to my father David." And I just love the fact that this is, ultimately just pointing at the fact that God's hands and God's words are behind all of this, and all of the broken people that he's used all the way from back in the garden and Abraham and everything. He's used his actions gently in the background. And it kind of reminds me of the book of Ruth, because in the book of Ruth, God isn't really actually overtly mentioned, right? And yet obviously his hands are on everything. Yeah. So I just thought that was a cool little moment.
Yeah, I like that, man. That's really cool. I hadn't picked that out. It's funny how reading through it, I swear, reading through the Bible is so interesting, because depending on your mindset and your attitude and your just general mood, everything, you pick out so many different things.
Yeah,
I don't know, because, and I'm not saying I was necessarily in a bad mood reading this, but the thing that I picked out first was in then 6 verse 14 onwards is Solomon's prayer. And I picked out last time, or a few days ago, whenever that was, about David's prayer and how he was just so passionate and everything like that. And it's all about how amazing God is and everything. When Solomon's praying here, there are a few instances throughout it. It's so differently worded. It gives a completely different feel to it. And it seems like I picked out a few in here. There's verse 18. He starts off with the heavens, even the highest heavens can't contain you, which is quite similar to a David-esque prayer. Then he says, how much less this temple I have built. And it's like he's talking about the temple I've built. Then in verse 24 and 25, when your people have been defeated by an enemy because they've sinned against you, and then hear from heaven and forgive us. It's like saying, when we sin, can you please forgive us though, please God? Which I'll touch on a bit later. Then further, do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that the people of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people, and they may know this house that I have built bears your name, which is then verse 33. Many things in it is actually, where's the focus here? Is the focus on God and how incredible and amazing God is for what he's said with his voice and done with his hands? Or is it about, actually, I've done a pretty good thing here, God? Are you noticing this? Where does that sit?
I couldn't agree more, and I feel like that links to in 2 Chronicles 7 now, verse 5. King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 head of cattle, 120,000 sheep and goats. The king and all the people dedicated the temple of God. I said that's a heck of a lot, and then I thought more about it, and I thought it's important to remember that obedience to God is far more important to God than sacrifice. Yes. And that kind of links to what you're saying, really, Ads, because it's this big show, isn't it? It's like, look how much I am sacrificing to God.
Yeah.
And it's still a good thing to do that, but it's the obedience to God that he wants much more than sacrifice. He doesn't need your sacrifice, doesn't need you to build the temple.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
He just wants your love and obedience and relationship.
Yeah, so I get you, man. There was a really cool bit in the Apologetics Bible, which I've just picked up here on that exact section there. And it's talking about the very large numbers of sacrifices have actually caused much comment. For the 15 days of the celebration, it was calculated that it would require 20 sacrifices per minute for 10 hours per day. Some resolve this as interpreting the numbers as hyperbole. Others suggest that by sacrifice meant Solomon gave the animals to the priest, but they weren't necessarily all sacrificed at that time during that celebration. So otherwise, heck, that's some slaughter for 15 days, 10 hours a day. Less sort of praise and worship, more like absolute carnage going on.
It's just, I said later on in 2 Chronicles 7:10, on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people to their homes, joyful and glad. So 23 days of partying. They knew how to party, right?
Yeah.
But that just adds to the level of carnage to me. They're having a glass of wine here, they're having a dance there, and they're slitting every throat of every animal. just the weirdest thing.
No kidding.
It's funny as well because I'm normally the numbers guy to some extent, and I didn't even think of that. I was like, but you're right. Or what else do they do? Just shove them in a blender, just like slowly. There's just a weird grinding conveyor belt.
Just ground beef is flying out the far end, which of course is mince, but
just like lamb burgers being made for everyone. No, that's really funny. The only thing with just going back to the kind of volume and stuff that I should mention, I love, especially when we're reading the Old Testament, as much as possible to point it back to Jesus as well, because obviously that's the most important thing. The whole Bible ultimately is the story of God, is the glorification of Jesus. So the fact that Solomon gives all of this, and yet ultimately he's not necessarily obedient, he's just focused on sacrifice. It just reminds me of when you'll have to help me out with this, Ads, being the Christian veteran. But there's a story, I believe, or a moment where an older lady, like a widow or a very poor lady, drops like a single penny, like a single coin in as a donation for something. And Jesus said, like, her donation is like everything. And like, that's the most generous person compared to these others that were giving lots, right? Yes. So it's also your heart posture. Solomon had a lot. So giving a lot doesn't necessarily mean as much compared to someone who has nothing and still gives what tiny little bit they have.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, you're pretty spot on. It was the Pharisees were dropping like big bags of coins into the offering bowl, and she just dropped 2 small pennies, and actually they're giving out of their wealth. She's giving out of her poverty, and like it hits her more because she has less. So yeah, that's a really valid point. I'm just gonna fly back here into when I mentioned that in verse 24 during his prayer about how when we've been defeated by an enemy, when we've sinned against you, come back and forgive us. There's a thing which I remember I mentioned it to you when you first became a Christian, and I know it's been a big thing for me with some things that I've gone through, is your mindset going into Christian life in general, but going into each individual day and situation and circumstance where you're going to be faced with temptation and temptation to sin, is if you go in with the mindset of like, I could well screw up here, I'm going to screw up here, like you're far more likely to. And the thing that came to me once was an analogy of a boxer preparing for a fight. I don't know if I've mentioned it before on the podcast.
You have. I don't know about on the podcast, but you've definitely mentioned it to me.
Yeah. In case I haven't, then I'll say it again. If I have, then cool. But it's this concept of any boxer goes into a fight believing 100% they're going to win that fight. They're not necessarily going to win that fight. Like very few boxers have you got Floyd Mayweather as pretty much one of the only undefeated boxers there are, but boxers, fighters in general, whether it's MMA, whatever, will be defeated. But if they go into that fight thinking they could lose, that's half the battle lost. If we go into a situation thinking we could screw up, the chances of us screwing up have just been frigging elevated. And so we have to have that mindset of like, no, I'm going to succeed here. I will succeed here. And
I completely agree. And the other part of the boxer analogy is boxers have to be insanely disciplined with everything, right?
True.
And I think that's the same sort of thing. Like if you go in with the mindset that you can't fail, failure is not an option, and you have that discipline, you're much more likely to succeed.
Yeah.
And then obviously it's just prayer as well. Great point, man. Final thing from me for today. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the palace he built for her. He said, my wife must not live in the palace of David, king of Israel, because the places the ark of the Lord has entered are holy. So this is also a big part of his downfall. Like he openly admits here that he's marrying a non-believer, going against the rules. And rather than just not marrying, talk about discipline or lack of it, right? Rather than just not marrying this woman, even though he's got like 1,000 other women as well, by the way, he still marries her and says, yeah, well, I just won't take her to the holy place.
Yeah.
So it's just the beginning of that downfall, and the sexual sin of Solomon is a big problem he has, the same as his father, the same as David, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, tomorrow's readings, 2 Chronicles 9, 10, 11, and 12. So why don't you beautiful people pick up your Bibles and get reading?
In the meantime, please consider sharing this with someone or joining us on social media at 2 Brits and a Bible.